Tonight on Connect New York, school funding in New York State. The governor says we spend more on education than any other state in the nation. So then why are many of our schools cut to the bone? And is the way we distribute that state funding fair? Join Commissioner MaryEllen Elia and a panel of education experts for this critical conversation next on Connect New York. Welcome to Connect New York, conversations that matter to you. I'm Susan Arbetter. Your state public broadcasters are moving beyond the sound bites and digging into education issues that everyone is talking about, like how we fund our schools and whether we do it fairly. While New York is a high-spending state, we're also among the nation's least balanced. When it comes to funding public education, it all comes down to zip code. If you're fortunate enough to live in one of the state's wealthy suburbs, chances are your schools are excellent and your property taxes ensure that they stay that way. But what if you live in a poor inner city or rural area and your district is completely dependent on state aid? Will your children have the same opportunities as the kids from the suburbs? We know that it takes more money to educate children of poverty. We know that it takes more money to educate children of refugees and kids who don't speak English. And while the state sends more money to low-wealth districts than wealthy ones, the gap in total per-pupil spending has given rise to another, more dangerous and persistent kind of gap, one in achievement. Today, we'll discuss what is equitable funding, how funding is distributed, who makes those decisions, and whether the funding formula should be changed with a panel of 5 experts. First, joining us as she does for each and every Connect New York on Education is State Education Commissioner MaryEllen Elia. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hey there, Susan.
So the state's constitution says that every child should receive a sound basic education. Do you believe that every child in New York right now is receiving a sound basic education?
Well, we have, as you know, over 650 districts across this state. And many of the decisions that are made regarding an education in their district is made by those individual districts. So one of the things that I think that we have to, as the state ed department, do is we have to make sure that districts make decisions and support what we believe are really critical pieces to that. Much of that is in legislation, and we're working very hard for districts to implement those things that are identified as being part of what would be considered the best education a student can get across this state. So we have some issues to address. There's no question. This year, the request from the regents and the budget request that went across to the legislature and the governor's office identified what we believe is necessary for the funding formulas, both the restoration and the funding that was in the GEA should be restored. We believe
we're going to get to all of this in a second. Sure.
I know, but I think that the big issue is that we all have to know that this is a time when we have to fund the infrastructure of education to support the infrastructure of this state. And that means that children across this state have the opportunities in every district to get that education.
We have spoken to people like Merrill Tisch and the former commissioner, Dr. John King. When I asked that question of them, they both said, no, we do not provide every child with a sound basic education, and you agree with that?
Well, of course, and you have so many differences. Over 650 districts across the state are making decisions, and it's not equitable.
No. The Utica City Schools is one of the districts where the school aid formula has not adequately accounted for poverty. Here's Connect New York's Domi Mogunga.
Have you ever been at the state fair and gone in one of those House of Mirrors that's a maze?
The fun house that lawmakers and school districts enter to finance education in New York leaves no one involved laughing.
They back into who's going to get how much money based upon political factors, who's got the most vocal state legislator, instead of based on what it should be based on, which is based on student need and a community's relative ability to pay, how much wealth there is in a community.
It can be traced back to the 1990s when a group of New York City families sued the state. They argued that their children were not receiving the constitutionally granted sound basic education because New York was not adequately funding their schools. The families won. That case was the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit known as CFE.
That settlement is what's produced the commitment, the CFE, Campaign for Fiscal Equity commitment, where schools to this day are still owed almost $5 billion. One of the upshots of that was also the creation of what's called the foundation aid formula, which is a fair distribution method if they use it. The biggest problem with the foundation formula is they haven't used it in years. If you don't fund it, I can guarantee you it will not work.
The foundation aid formula accounts for poverty, but the legislature never fully funded it because of the recession. But that's not all. In 2010, the legislature started taking money away from schools via the Gap Elimination Adjustment, or GEA. In this year's executive budget, Governor Andrew Cuomo neither fully eliminates the GEA nor fully funds foundation aid. Instead, he has proposed a budget increase of $991 million. That is less than half of what activists had pushed for.
$991 million sounds like a lot of money. It's certainly a lot of money to me or you, but when you have 2.7 million students in the state, it's not that much money. It's not nearly adequate. The Board of Regents say we need a $2.4 billion increase in 1 year. We say $2.9 billion.
One reason it's inadequate is the tax cap. Because inflation is so low, the cap is just about flat, which means localities will not be able to raise revenue.
As our costs continue to rise, the tax cap has frozen our revenue stream locally. So in order to make up for the lack of local resources, we need to make it up in state aid.
With healthcare, pension, and special education costs on the rise, schools have two choices: to either cut or ask for more state aid.
Well, we've already have cut since the Great Recession started in 2010, 2009. For school districts, we've lost about 30,000 employees.
You can see the impact today in places like Utica. The school district has cut 365 positions over just 4 years.
The Utica City School District has been underfunded for many, many years. That we have been shorted or underfunded in the neighborhood of about $47 million, and that is just in one given year.
But it is not just the amount of funding that advocates say is a problem. It's how it's distributed. The governor says that New York has one of the most well-funded public school systems in the country, and that not all districts spend the same on education.
You can have a school district upstate that spends $15,000 or $16,000 per pupil. You can have school districts on Long Island that are spending on average around $25,000, $26,000.
Utica is considered a low-wealth school. It spends in the mid-teens per pupil. Utica also has the second lowest property values with which to raise taxes out of all 674 school districts in New York State. And many of the students need extra help.
There are some school districts on the island that maybe would spend $46,000 per pupil, but then they only have like 50 students or 100 students. So it's skewed by the fact that they have such a low number of students.
In a district with a substantial refugee community, citizens and leaders in the heart of the Mohawk Valley believe more funding needs to come here.
It helped districts like the city of Utica, who is a high-need district, very large refugee population, but moreover, it's a poor district and it's an urban district. So the foundation aid fit us well, and for those years it worked well. We service a very high-needs population, so that requires support services, social workers, counselors, psychologists, teachers with support programs, AIS, all of those requirements, and it costs money to provide that education.
So it trickles down into the classroom across the board. If you take a look at issues like books, materials, supplies. For example, I teach social studies. Part of the things that you need to teach in social studies are maps. We teach geography. We're lacking in those basic supplies. If you go look at a local suburban district like Holland Patton, New Hartford, they have those basic supplies that we're not able to afford here.
Do high-need school districts need more resources? Yes.
In Utica, I'm Domi Magunga for Connect New York.
We have a stellar group of panelists for our discussion today. They are Dr. Rick Timms, Executive Director of the Statewide School Finance Consortium. Andy Pallotta is the Executive Vice President of New York State United Teachers. Michelle Brantner is here. She's the Superintendent of the Moravia Central Schools in upstate New York. Suzanne Slack is the Chief Financial Officer of the Syracuse City School District. And David Flatley is the superintendent of the Carle Place School District, which is out on Long Island. I want to welcome all of you for being here. I know a lot of you travel very far distances, so we appreciate it. We're going to start with a quick primer on school financing. And I think, Rick Timms, why don't you help us out? Give us a quick a lesson on how schools are funded. Where does the money come from?
Well, there's a number of revenue streams, but there are two major pieces. One is the state aid that was talked about in your tape, and the second one is property taxes. Those are the usual two large streams. The state aid is for poorer districts or average wealth and below average wealth districts. That is the primary source of their funds. And property taxes is a lesser amount. And in wealthier districts, it's basically almost the reverse.
Is that because, let's say in Syracuse, for example, there's a lot of poverty in Syracuse, so my assumption is that their property wealth is very low and wouldn't be able to raise a lot of local taxes in order to pay for schools?
Right. Part of the formula for the distribution of the state aid is fiscal capacity. So when they have low income, and they also have low property values, but also the other part is student demographics. That's another portion of the formula. And so what happens is the higher the poverty level, of course, the aid would flow more to those types of districts.
We spend a lot of money on schools, Andy Pallotta, and the governor says that all the time. So how is it that groups like NYSUD and others say we need to spend more on schools? How do you reconcile both of those things?
When we look historically, even just back to 2008-9, at the cuts that were done to the New York State public schools, you see why we are in the position that we're in. We've mentioned 30,000 less educators in the classroom. We've mentioned all the programs that have been cut. This is a perfect opportunity for us in this state to make up for those losses, for those cuts. And we hear around the state how diverse we are, and yet how the inequality of funding schools is just not going away.
You have a very good way of explaining average per pupil funding, because we have our average per pupil funding, Rick, that's very high, maybe the highest in the nation. Mm-hmm. What does that say to you, though, in terms of the money that kids get?
Well, the average funding per pupil is kind of like a misuse of statistics. So the usual thing I usually say is, let's take a look at average. Let's look at the definition of average. My head is in the oven, my feet are in the freezer, and on average I feel just fine. So what actually happens, we have some districts that have very few kids. They're spending over about $90,000 a child. And we have other districts spending close to $11,000 a child. Now, part of it is based on the number of children they have, but the other part is exactly what is the challenge or the mission of that district. Kids who are high in poverty, kids who are receiving federal programs for free and reduced lunch, kids who are homeless, kids who do not speak English because we have a huge immigrant population in some of these schools, and so on. So by just cutting quick to the average really doesn't tell the whole story.
Right. What would be our mean?
Well, we're probably pretty close to around $17,000, $18,000 per student.
Which is still pretty high.
Well, it is, but don't forget New York State is a high-cost district. I mean, try and hire a plumber or a welder or someone to fix your car, and you'll find that out compared to other states, for instance.
Okay, so what we have is a diverse group of school districts with us. We have Michelle, who's from a more rural area. We have Suzanne, who is from a Big Five. Mm-hmm. And we have David, who is from a suburban district. What I'd love to do is have each of you talk about the socioeconomic snapshot of your school district and how you raise your money. And why don't we start with David Flatley, who's from Nassau County in Long Island.
Sure. So Carle Place is a very small, geographically tiny, 1 square mile school district in the heart of Nassau County. And yet we have just about 1,400 students in our K-12 school district. So we are proud of the fact that the community supports us through property taxes. Only about 10% of our annual budget comes to us from state aid. And so the community is essentially on their own in terms of supporting the school district.
So what is your per pupil spending?
Our per pupil spending approaches $30,000 a year.
Okay.
However, as has been pointed out, the cost of living on Long Island, the cost of purchasing a home on Long Island, makes it impossible for us to significantly reduce that and pay our teachers and our administrators a wage that makes it possible for them to raise a family on Long Island.
Interestingly, Carl Place's property taxes for homeowners aren't that enormous because you have a lot of commercial properties that you're taxing. But what about in where you live, David, in Levittown?
Sure. I'm a proud resident of Levittown. I've been for about a quarter century. Raised my kids there. And my 60 by 100 plot on a house that was built by Bill Levitt almost 60 years ago.
The Bill Levitt.
The Bill Levitt. That home carries a property tax burden of about $13,000 a year.
Okay.
So slightly more than $1,000 a month goes to paying our property tax. Very happy to pay that because our schools in Levittown have done a marvelous job.
Let's move to Suzanne Slack, who's the CFO of the Syracuse City Schools. Give us a socioeconomic snapshot of your district.
Sure. So Syracuse has just over 21,000 students. 75% of them are minorities, and as the recent reports have shown, the poverty in Syracuse has actually gotten worse since the last census that was taken in 2010. So the students coming to our schools are poorer than they have been traditionally. They're coming from a variety of backgrounds. Many of them, about 3,300 of our students today, are refugee students. So they come to school not only not having an educational background, not knowing how to cross the street perhaps, how to sit in a classroom and hold a pencil, how to have the social norms that we have here in our society. The property tax is an issue for us in Syracuse. We don't levy property tax as a school district. The city does that. So our property taxes have been flat for about 15 years. So we've lived with a property tax cap here in Syracuse for a very long time, and I'm sorry that our comrades are going to be going through that as well. But here in Syracuse, over half of our properties are tax exempt. So if you think about the hospitals and the universities and the government agencies that are located here, they aren't even on the tax rolls to contribute to the school taxes.
So if somebody was going to say to you, well, we're going to raise property taxes 5% in Syracuse, it really wouldn't do much, would it?
I would take it, but you are correct. It would not do much.
I'm sure that you would.
I would take it. So we rely on the state for over 70 cents of every dollar that we receive. So when the state aid funding is reduced or it doesn't go up as much as it should, it has a very significant impact on the Syracuse School District.
How much money per pupil do you think you spend?
Just over $19,000 per pupil.
And there are challenges that your kids bring to school every day. You mentioned about the refugees. You mentioned there are kids who have never even been in a school setting before. It costs more to educate these kids, doesn't it?
It does. We have over 70 languages spoken in our school district. Just think about that. So it's our obligation to teach these children. We have to translate the tests and the documents in their language. We have to have translators there to interpret what the English-speaking teacher may be saying in order for the students to understand and learn. And we do that. We want them to pass their ELA exam the first year that they're here in the country, but we have a lot of barriers to overcome in order to get them there, and that's very expensive.
ELA is English Language Arts. Michelle Brantner, you are the superintendent of Moravia in Cayuga County. This is a smaller, more rural school district. What's it like socioeconomically?
So Moravia is a district that sits in the heart of the Finger Lakes. We encompass about 147 square miles in contrast to 1 square mile, which is an interesting thing to think about. We're seeing an increase in students coming from poverty. I think when I came to the district in 2009, our free and reduced price lunch percent was approximately 38.5%. And today we're at approximately 45% K-12, and many of our elementary age students, I would say the number is more around the 50% mark. So we're just seeing a different demographic of student walk in the classroom, a lot of needs. While we do not face issues with students coming from different countries, refugees, and students speaking different languages, that has not been a factor. We certainly are seeing a lot of kids with just dramatic needs.
What does rural poverty look like?
Rural poverty looks like students coming hungry, students often without supervision at home, students from families that are not able to kind of provide the time, place, and support to do any sort of homework or reading. We have kindergarten students coming that haven't held a book, don't understand how to turn the pages, don't know the basics of, writing their name, letters.
What is your per pupil spending on average?
Our per pupil spending is probably fairly similar to the city of Syracuse.
About 19?
About, I would say, under 19, but just.
So, Commissioner, we have all different, and they're all under your umbrella. You're responsible for all of them. Can you explain why, some of the reasons why poverty costs money?
Oh, absolutely. So if you just think of almost as a continuum, and you think about a child that walks into the classrooms, and I think, our superintendents are the ones that they face this every single year, trying to address needs, and those needs change every year. So if you think of a child who walks in who's had a rich environment at home, lots of books, the kinds of activities that parents are trying to provide for their children, they come into school with that experience. A child in poverty who has been born into poverty and their parents are struggling, working very hard to support them, but probably working more than one job, less opportunity to be with their children, and working to make sure that they're safe, but the kind of opportunities to provide an environment for children to be ready when they walk into kindergarten is a really critical thing. And we know that our children come in at various levels on this continuum. And so it's very difficult for districts like Syracuse and Moravia that are facing those issues to say, okay, in our classrooms we have the, students at various levels. We have to have teachers and supports for those students. And on top of that, one of the other issues is the issues that are facing, that those families are facing every year. So the concept of providing support activities and staff for them. And I think that the psychologists and the social workers, there was a time when that wasn't part of the experience in American schools.
But it has to be.
It has to be now. If we don't provide those things for families, we will never be able to address those issues with children. And so when you see that funding has decreased, and particularly in these schools that don't have a strong tax base, and you know that they have to keep a classroom teacher in place, some of the things that were taken off the page and moved out of their experience for these children were those extras. Right. And they aren't extras, but in some cases, when you think about what is it I'm going to make a decision on and cut, you know that those are the things that would be taken off the page first.
So, Commissioner, if we know that more money is going to lower wealth districts, more school aid, state aid is going to lower wealth districts, but it's not enough to offset the low property wealth. So, how should the state respond to that?
Well, I think that the recommendations on the budgets that came out of the regents, came out of NYSET, came out of a number of different agencies that made recommendations, those are really addressing it through the foundation aid, and that's where it has to be addressed. But understand, we have the gap elimination and what occurred there.
Which is yet another burden.
We have to make that whole. We have to get that fully funded. And then we have to address the issues of foundation aid, which we, even within the budgets that we've projected from the regents and other groups, are not going to totally take care of the foundation aid, but we're working in the same direction. But I think it's important to say that to get there, we've got to make these investments in the infrastructure of education.
Absolutely. We're going to come back to the GEA foundation aid formula question in a minute. It is important to note that New York's courts have weighed in on the fairness question. And Andy Pallotta, why don't you tell us about the ruling in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case? What did it say about how New York funds schools, and what was the court's prescription?
That it was not equal, that what we have in this state, and we've just heard, that in this state you can be in one school district and they'll spend $17,000, $19,000, and in another school district they'll be spending $30,000 to $90,000 on that same education. What we need in the school budgets now is a tremendous infusion of funds. Other states have a tax cap. Massachusetts has a tax cap, but they
The state funded the schools to a much greater extent after the tax cap was implemented, though.
And so what we have in our state is a period when we're in a vice, where there's spending cuts for years, where 1/3 of our schools still don't have the same money that they had in 2009. And you also have the tax cap, which this year we believe is taking $700 million out of the coffers of local school districts.
Rick, has the state met its obligations under CFE?
Absolutely not. Let me give you a couple of quick points here. One is the poorest school districts in the state of New York, based on fiscal capacity, that would be their income and property values, they receive actually 4 times more state aid than the wealthiest districts in the state.
Think about Buffalo or Syracuse.
So they receive 4 times more. So you would say, well, the poor districts get more state aid. But the problem is the wealthiest school districts are almost 15 times wealthier than the poor districts. So in other words, the ratio doesn't follow through. So do they get more money? Yes. Is it enough? No. And is the ratio complete? No.
How much, if the state decided tomorrow, Rick, you know what, we're going to completely fund all the schools and we're going to pay what we owe under CFE, how much money would that be?
It would be a total of probably close to $5 billion. It would be $434 million in the GEA. Has to be restored, and they owe $4.4 billion to school districts in the basic foundation aid right now as we're sitting here.
So, Michelle, tomorrow is a good day when the state says that. What does that mean for Moravia? What are you able to do?
Well, in terms of GEA, we've taken over an $8 million hit in Moravia, and in terms of being fully funded for foundation aid, we've taken about a $13 million hit. I can hardly fathom what the combination of that funding would look like and do for our students. It's funny, many years I drew a comparison between a wealthy school district that was exactly our size and our school district, just to show my community what a different education looks like when there's actually funding. And we would often joke about trying desperately to hold on to our Spanish classes so that we can actually meet the Part 100 regs, when, you know, children in another school district exactly of our size, you know, have 3 or 4 languages to choose from, not to mention a myriad of other programs. So it would mean tremendous things for our students.
So let's contrast that with Carl Place. David Flatley, how are you?
I'm great, thank you.
So if the state decided tomorrow to fully fund CFE, what would that mean for your district?
Sure. So CFE has cost the underfunding of CFE has cost the Carl Place School District about $11 million. And even in a relatively wealthy place, $11 million is real money.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's a significant loss to the taxpayers in my community who are paying enormous property taxes to fund our schools because the state hasn't met its obligation to meet its fair share of the funding. You know, lots of folks believe that everyone on Long Island is wealthy. Interestingly, the comptroller just last week came out with a list of schools that are facing fiscal stress in New York State. 30% of those schools are on Long Island. When you look at the funding formulas that we've heard about today, an important one is the combined wealth ratio formula. It's a number that indicates just how wealthy is your school district. And if you are, if that formula shows that you have a combined wealth ratio of 1, you're average around New York State. Half of the kids on Long Island, that's about 230,000 students, attend schools that have combined wealth ratios beneath number 1. And so are in schools that are less wealthy than the average school district in New York State.
What is the combined wealth ratio of Utica?
I think it's around 2.27. I think somewhere in there, 0.27 or 0.22.
So compare that to 1.
Well, it's less than a quarter. So it has less than a quarter property and income value on average than the average school district in the state of New York.
So when it comes to raising taxes, there's no there.
There's nothing to tax, and if they did have something to tax, no one would have any money to pay it.
David.
So that's kind of an interesting problem on Long Island as well. So I think about people who are perhaps my dad's age, who now live in Carl Place. Just about every Tuesday afternoon, I get together with some of our senior citizens and have conversations with them. And they purchased homes 55, 60 years ago for $15,000.
Sure.
That home in Carl Place today might be worth $750,000. That's no money in the pocket of those people who are paying their property taxes. So to include that number in their supposed wealth is a huge disservice to those folks who have been living on in our community and supporting our schools for a long time.
Which leads to the question of how we fund our schools, and we're going to get to that in a moment. Sharon, I wanted to give you an opportunity to answer the question, if Syracuse City Schools, Suzanne, if the Syracuse City Schools just decided, oh, look, we're going to get our CFE money tomorrow, what does that mean for you? What will that mean?
So for Syracuse, the CFE funding is nearly $700 million. So that's twice our annual budget.
$700 million.
$700 million that has been withheld over the last 10 years. So think of the things we could do. We could transport all children to help make sure they all make it to school every day in the weather and in the issues that we have in an urban setting. We could provide academic resources for every student, not just select students. We could get our schools eventually off of a receivership list. We could start to have more robust career and technical education services to make sure our kids graduate college and career ready.
Commissioner, do you believe that the state needs to fulfill its obligation under CFE?
Yes, I do. I mean, I'm realistic to the point where I think that has to be phased in. That is not going to happen in one single year, which is why if you go to the requested funds for education that the Regents Board made, I think it's reasonable for us to increase the amount and get to where we need to be in a relatively short period of time and make that happen for the students of this state.
Let me ask you a funny kind of question.
I always love those.
What kind of political capital are you willing to expend on pushing lawmakers on this issue?
Well, let me say, I think the Regents, our budget this year pushed, and it's in line with a number of others who are sitting here and districts who are supported here by agencies across the state. We are with them, and we are pushing to get the opportunities in place for kids across the state equally.
The legislature always adds to the governor's budget. That traditionally, that's what happens. The governor put forth a budget that's less than $1 billion increase this year. I think the Regents said 2.4, 2.9.
2.4.
2.4. Are you going to be pushing for that much of an increase? Because that might be more than some of the lawmakers are willing to put out there.
Well, I clearly have been very vocal. I was in front of the Budget and Ways and Means Committee for 4.5 hours last week. I answered a number of questions. I thought it went really quickly. But I will tell you that I believe that we have the responsibility to make sure that the infrastructure, I keep going back to this, we are creating the future for New York State in all the schools across the state. And we can't not do that. We won't get where we need to be, and so we can talk about developing infrastructure everywhere else, but the real infrastructure that's going to make all those things occur is with our education system and our schools.
When you say infrastructure, are you talking about ensuring that state ed, for example, has enough people to do what it needs to do to implement stuff?
Well, it certainly is an issue. I mean, we have a lot of things that I've put on the plate with the Regents Board, and we've started some movement that way relative to reviewing standards, relative to changing assessments and working with our teachers on that.
That Common Core Task Force.
All of the regulations and the recommendations that came out of the Common Core Task Force. We don't have funding for any of those things, even though it was clear that they were out prior to any budgets being announced. So I do think it's a very important thing that we look at what is going to make us move forward. And we aren't in the position at this point in time until a final budget is determined. We are not in a position where we know where people are on moving us forward with education to support every child, all of the teachers in our classrooms, all of the things that we know our kids need because of the poverty that they're living in across this state. We are not there yet. And so this is an extremely important discussion for all of us to have and to continue to have.
There are other lawsuits, Andy, that are wending their way through the legal system that could affect how we fund our schools. They could have the effect of underscoring the CFE decision. What are those lawsuits?
The small cities lawsuit, bringing money into a city like Utica, like Poughkeepsie. These cities have been underfunded for years now. And when we combine that with CFE, which really is like not paying a bill, you have been ordered by the courts to pay this money. And if I don't pay my electric bill, I'm sitting in the dark. The state owes the schools this money. And now is this great opportunity where they have this humongous surplus, $5.4 billion surplus. This is the time to put these huge infusions into the schools.
There's also the NYSER case.
Right, New York State's for Students' Educational Rights. It's a case across the state whereby they are claiming, similar to the small cities case, that the state has underfunded school districts for approximately 7 to 9 years to the tune of over $5 billion in the current dollars, and that this has got to be remedied right away. They also point out in the lawsuit that the elements of the foundation aid formula need to be updated and recalculated to actually create greater equity. I know we've used the term equal here today, but the term really should be equity. We don't want everybody treated equally. We want them treated
What does that mean, Rick?
Well, the difference between treating people equally and treating them equitably would be characterized as this type of thing. If I handed out a dollar bill to each person in here, regardless of your capacity to pay your water bill, I would treat you equally. But if I handed out the same amount of money by distributing it differently, that would give you a greater capacity to pay your water bill, it would be more equitable.
So let's look at the foundation aid formula. It is sort of old. It needs to be dusted off and opened up and looked at and tweaked. What would you tweak about it?
Well, there's a number of things. First of all, I think one of the big problems we have with the formula is I don't think it treats poverty very well. It does have an extra weighting in there to help places that have higher poverty levels, but the weighting is not significant enough to make as much of an impact as it should. It should have also greater weighting and emphasis on districts that have students with limited English proficiency, those types of students. It should also have a greater analysis in terms of the fiscal capacity of the district. In other words, its actual property and income values. In some places, what we have is to the point from Carl Place, I think is significant. We have places all over the state whereby they have a lake, a river stream, or a mountaintop, or they're near something that of some value where people who have wealth have come there and bought property, and therefore their property values are very high. But the people who live there basically make no money at all. So what happens is it skews the relative wealth of the school district. So that's got to be done. There's a number of things like that.
All right. So there's math in the formula that needs
70
to be
pages
changed.
Actually worth of math.
It's a very detailed sort of formula. There's also a political calculation that's sort of laid on top of it like a scrim. And that's known as the shares agreement. Rick, can you explain what that is?
Sure. Back in about 1988, we had a change in leadership in the New York State Senate. And from that time on, the distribution of state funds would come out something like this. Around 38% or so of all state aid to school districts happened to end up in New York City. And around 13% would end up in Long Island, treating it as if it's all one island, one place, and it's very diverse, as has been pointed out here. And then a certain percentage would go to the northern suburbs, and the remainder would go to the rest of New York State. So they were divided into shares, and it was a political dynamic based on the power within the Senate and voting in the Senate. Interestingly, here we are in 2015-2016 school year, and despite all this, quote, trying to get equity, increased money for foundation aid, new formula, CFE case, the distribution of those funds by percent in regions has not changed, because in the formula, there are parts put into the formula to make sure that that distribution does not go away.
Does anyone think that that's equitable, David?
No. Carl Place, Long Island, all of Long Island educates about 16% of the students in New York State, and we receive about 14% of the aid. And I believe that if you take a look at where the tax dollars are coming from in terms of income tax, you'd find that a pretty significant chunk of the support for the monies that we're talking about right now are coming from folks on Long Island. So, no, I don't think it's working, and I don't think it's working for anyone. But before we reach conclusions about how to fix it, I think it's important to fully fund foundation aid see if that has the kind of impact that we're looking for, and then have an opportunity to tinker with the 70 pages of formulas that go into working out how much each of our school districts receive.
Michelle, how would you tinker with that 70 pages?
I would ask Rick. No, I agree with what Rick said. Certainly, I think wealth is not treated fairly, or lack of wealth, poverty is not treated fairly in the formula. And we're one of those districts that have a slightly skewed CWR due to the combined wealth ratio, due to the fact that, we sit on a lake and we have people that own lake property that, don't send their students to our school district. And then when you look at our FRIPL count, which is our free and reduced price lunch numbers, you see a dramatic difference. When you're talking about almost half of our students are living in poverty, it doesn't line up with even a combined wealth ratio of 0.625, which, while it's below average wealth, it isn't 0.22. It's not 0.27.
It's not like Utica, exactly. So let's turn to Suzanne now. So what about Syracuse? How would you tweak the formula to better help your kids?
I agree with what Rick said. I think the formula has to take into account the real impact of poverty and what funding is needed for that, as well as the impact of the English language learners. The shares agreement doesn't help us here in Syracuse whatsoever.
Would you say you're a loser under the shares agreement?
Yes, I would say Syracuse loses out significantly in that scenario. But I also think there's other factors that need to be considered. In some of the calculations, the poverty rate is from the 2000 census. Not the 2010, the 2000 census.
And there's greater poverty now.
There's much different, at least in Syracuse, poverty looks much different today than it did 15 years ago. I think that looking at consideration for an ability to raise tax and really giving value to that. We have lived under this tax cap for many, many years, and so have other Big Five districts. Now that all the urban and rural districts are going to go through that, you really need to take that into consideration. You can't limit your ability to raise funding in a district and then also cut back on the state aid that you rely on.
So you're listening to this, Commissioner. What are you thinking?
Well, I don't think there's any question that we have to update and actually get the real numbers in all of those formulas, because things change. I mean, let's face it, we've gone through a huge recession, depression, however we want to term it, and those things have changed. So we have more kids in poverty. We have it in different places. We have a Long Island that has a number of districts that are facing financial issues that I'm sure when those formulas were put together, they weren't in that same place. And so I think it's absolutely critical for us to do that. And then I think it's the next step in a process would be to look at what are the key factors in the formula, and are those appropriate, and are they at the level that they need to be. So there's really two steps. Let's get it up, and let's get this year, let's get formula, the formula reality that we have now, live with that, get rid of the GEA, increase our foundation aid, and then I think the next logical step is for us to update those numbers in the formula and take a look at how it really drives it.
Suzanne and then David.
Thank you. On the gap elimination adjustment, everybody is cheering that it's almost all gone, and the Senate and Assembly have said we're going to get rid of it.
Especially the Senate.
Yes.
The Assembly is more interested in foundation aid.
Yes, and we appreciate both perspectives on that. But I want to tell you, from a district that's lived through significant reductions, we lost $55 million in 4 years in the gap elimination adjustment. What it is to us, it was an interest-free loan from us to the state. So don't just get rid of it, but it needs to be paid back.
With interest?
Well, I'll take it back at this point. Interest would be great. We don't get interest-free loans from the state. We can't afford to give them interest-free loans.
David.
So if I'm going to hold the governor and the legislature responsible for anything in this conversation, it's to find new sources of revenue. And because I understand that they have a responsibility to allocate scarce resources, then their responsibility includes finding new ways to increase those resources.
So not just state aid, not just property taxes. What could you possibly mean?
So I think we are over-reliant upon property taxes. I think some of the stories that I've talked about illustrate that pretty clearly. I think that there are segments of our economy in New York State that aren't paying their fair share in terms of the infrastructure of our educational system.
Like which?
And I would say that the lower half of the Manhattan Island is probably in the target area.
Wall Street?
Wall Street in particular. I think, a very simple nickel per trade or penny per share tax would go a long way to weaning us off the property tax that's causing so much trouble for so many people.
That has not been on the table recently, Andy Pallotta, specifically because of where the former speaker lived, which was, he represented that area of Manhattan. We have a different speaker now. Is that now on the table?
I would say that would be an interesting way to go in trying raising funds throughout the state. I think Speaker Hasty putting forward the rise in the personal income tax on those making over $1 million and bringing in almost $1 billion, I believe his proposal would bring into the state, is a good start.
Although you're not talking about a personal income tax. You're talking about a corporate tax on trades.
Exactly.
Right. Also going after some of the real estate deals and subsidies that are done in that same area where we have folks that come in from other countries and invest in high-end condos and receive tax breaks.
This is a big deal in New York City.
Yes. And also we have a $5.4 billion surplus. Let's use that right now. We're not in scarce times anymore.
What do you think, Rick?
Well, I think the idea of having a surtax or some type of charge on trades would be a great idea. I think it's probably better than a personal income tax, because people could move out of state or all kinds of things, or corporations could move, but Wall Street's not going anywhere. They just can't pick up Wall Street and move it. That's what makes the property tax such a good thing in a way, is that if they tax your property, the property is always there, so it doesn't go away in a recession. So certainly the state's got to get much more creative. I think the key thing here is that things are not working now, and if they're going to continue to do what they've always done, they're going to get what they've always gotten, and we've got to make some changes. We're really in a new area, new realm, and a new place in terms of the needs of education, in terms of the needs of the state, and they've got to start thinking that way. Trying to keep things that don't work going is simply ridiculous.
Well, let's just go back to the shares agreement for a moment. We know who loses under the shares agreement. Who wins?
Well, actually, wealthier districts seem to win. Let's just take Long Island, for example, because I think we've had a great example of Long Island. About 30% of the school districts in Long Island are basically low-wealth districts. Now, while the island may get a certain share, the truth of it is some of that money is actually skimmed off to go to wealthy districts, and those poor districts really don't get as much. So the idea that they're getting a certain share in itself is one problem, but the idea of how that is distributed within the island is actually another problem. For instance, my colleague's home district here is really basically about an average school district, and they probably ought to be getting more support as well as the poorer schools.
Carl Place.
But there are some districts there are districts on the island that are 25, 30, 40, I say 40 times wealthier than his district. They're still getting state aid and support to a level you start wondering about. Now, I wouldn't want to take any money away from anyone, but I think going forward, we start a redistribution of this money to make it much more equitable. And this could occur across the state. You don't see many wealthy districts above the Tappan Zee Bridge, but there are some. And I think the wealth has got to be, the way it's distributed has got to be changed. It's not just the pool of money. This is critical, I think. It's not just getting $2.4 billion, not 2.9. Those numbers are important, but the distribution of those numbers are equally important.
Commissioner Elia, it's going to be politically a heavy lift to get lawmakers, especially those who benefit from the status quo, to take our 70-page funding formula and put into it all of the different factors that we've been hearing, because the people who are benefiting from the status quo don't want to make a change.
Well, that certainly is the case, and so one of the things that I've said multiple times in multiple settings is we cannot have our children be associated with decisions made for political reasons, right? So if you're interested in doing what's right for the children of New York, and you can put yourself in a position to see the bigger picture of ultimately investing in students so that we have a stronger state and we're able to address all the issues that we have, then we need to look at this and take the politics out of the children's game.
I would love to hear from the superintendents and the CFO one more time. David Flatley, have you spoken to the lawmakers who represent your district? And if so, what have you said to them about your needs?
Sure. I speak with Senator Jack Martins and Assemblyman Ed Rah on a very regular basis. They are very clearly aware of the concerns that we have, in Carl Place and in all of the districts that they represent. I have talked to them about all of the issues that we've discussed here today. I've talked to them about finding additional revenue streams. I've talked to them about fully funding foundation aid, about addressing the oversimplicity of a shares understanding and the over-complexity of the foundation aid. And when you lay those things on top of each other, the folks in New York State don't understand how we fund this most important endeavor that we are about. And so I think that the foundation aid needs to be changed, and changed in a way that it's more transparent, so that folks understand where their tax dollars are going and how they are redistributed. It's a very important, complex task. And I, for one, feel that the folks who represent Carl Place are doing a great job at it. But because the state is as different as it is, as you travel from one area of the state to the next, the complexity of the issues are difficult to handle.
Michelle? I've
spent a fair amount of time with both my assemblyman and my senator. We're lucky that Assemblyman Finch, usually I'm in Albany at least a couple of times a year, and on one occasion he helps me gather some other folks together. Assemblyman Rah, I usually meet with every year. Assemblyman Oaks, the Ways and Means staffers are incredibly helpful. I've talked to them about very similar things.
What's a question, or what would you ask them right now if they were watching?
I would ask them if they're with us. The Senate obviously has been really pushing. Our senator, Senator Seward, they've been pushing consistently. I've met with Senator Flanagan every year. And I think Senator Flanagan came out very strong this year saying, something to the effect of there will not be a state budget if the GEA is still part of it.
I believe he said those exact words.
I believe those were his exact words, although I hate to quote him. And I would like to say I've been a part of convincing him repeatedly every year as I traipse down there, so that he understands and sees the faces of the children of Moravia as he's thinking about funding, which really has been my goal as a representative of that district.
Suzanne, what would you like to leave the viewers today with?
That this year we really need to, as the commissioner said, fund the foundation aid the way that it's set up to run, and put the money behind it this year and take a long-term approach to fix the formula going forward. Our local delegates here in Onondaga County have also been fantastic. This past year, we laid out for them exactly what we needed, and they were able to bring that home for us. So we're hopeful again this year to have that opportunity.
Rick, real quick, we have about 10 seconds.
I think the legislature has to step up to the plate and actually fulfill their obligation, start phasing in foundation aid in a grand way, seriously, eliminate the entire GEA, and strive toward equity immediately.
Andy Pilata?
I believe the legislature has heard from the people. I believe the forums around the state last year really made an impression. I believe they're going to do what's right by our students.
What do you think you've learned today?
Well, I have to say I've been working with the legislature, and particularly Chair Kathy Nolan in the Assembly and Carl Marcelino in the Senate.
These are the chairs.
The chairs of the Education Committee. And these are all issues that have been in front of them, and I know that they're working hard with our legislators. We have to make sure that we continue the arguments and press, but I think it's also important that as soon as this is over, and we know this year where we are, we continue to look for the way to correct these issues big time.
Big time. We are out of time. I want to thank our panelists tonight. You guys were just terrific. We've had Rick Timms of the Statewide School Finance Consortium. Thank you, Rick. Andy Pilata of NYSUT, Michelle Brantner of Moravia, Suzanne Slack of Syracuse, David Flatley of Coral Place. You have all been terrific, and we love your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Commissioner, what do you feel you need to do next when it comes to making sure the way we fund schools is more equitable?
Well, I think, we have a short-term goal this year, and I think we have to continue conversations and stress the importance of support for the foundation aid and elimination of the gap elimination. And I think we also
So you think gap elimination comes first before foundation aid?
That is what the Regents Board has put forward, and we think that that's an important thing, that it can be done this year, and we can still push for foundation aid. But I would say that it's equally important for us to keep this movement of looking at those formulas, updating the formulas, and then taking the next step and saying, are they where they need to be?
So that's a priority for you?
Absolutely.
I want to thank you very much for joining us, Commissioner MaryEllen Elia. We'll see you again next month, I hope. And I want to thank you for joining us. Our next Connect New York on education will focus on the achievement gap. It's going to air in March. Please check your local listings for air dates and times. I'm Susan Arbetter. Thank you so much for watching Connect New York.